All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining another AI in construction webinar. As always, feel free to pop things in the chat. I'd love to have questions along the way. Otherwise, I'll kind of go through this and we'll have some time at the end. So today I want to talk about talent developments, de-skilling, and some of the impacts that we're starting to see AI have, not just in construction, but they're going to be very relevant to construction. So it's a good time to kind of raise it as a kind of a thing to consider, both as a problem that is starting to show up and is very likely to continue to show up, but also the fact that AI not only is the source of some of the problems, but can also be one of the ways to address that problem. And I'm going to talk about all of that today. So we're going to start with this idea of de-skilling. So let's start with what the problem is. We're starting to see, as you'll see in a moment, some early evidence that this is a thing. And common sense says that if I'm giving somebody a crutch, they're going to use it because they've got a lot of other things going on. Then we can think about new ways to create and deliver learning. Now, this is really interesting in that these are such general purpose tools, and they're rapidly gaining more and more skills and more ability to actually do things. And we'll get into what I mean by that. So AI tools can actually really reduce the barriers to creating and deploying learning content. And the final one here is that AI itself is an area that is moving so quickly and is in such need of guidance and training so people don't burn too much time on what do you call it? On learning and so on. So if we can help make that faster and help make people give people the opportunity to learn from each other, it's its own thing, and we'll talk about that. So the question that I've kind of given the answer away to is, will agents and AI generally erode workers' capabilities? Well, the answer, no surprise, is yes. Forgive me, I went nuts speaking of being able to create imagery. I had some fun with ChatGPT, so this is a little bit on the bright side, but you get my point. So we've already had some evidence. Kind of interestingly, Microsoft was one of the more noteworthy studies that came out in January, resulting in a deterioration of cognitive faculties that ought to be preserved. Probably the most legalistic thing you're going to hear out of my mouth, certainly today. But basically, they're tap dancing around the fact that as people are leaning on AI to do some of their thinking for them, they're getting less good. And I don't think their brain is any different. I think maybe it's their confidence, but it doesn't matter what the cause is. The Their application of critical thinking and common sense and just brain power has been lessened by the presence of AI. And I think that's a really important thing for us to consider. Just because they may still have that basic capability, if they're not comfortable using it, it has the same result. And it's still early days. There's still a lot of studies, and trust me, there's going to be more. Um, but it starts to tell us that yes, that's true. University of Pennsylvania did the same thing with undergrads who, you would think are a little used to this sort of thing, but they also found that they weren't performing as well. Again, other studies have shown this for critical thinking and software developers, and we're starting to see there's more than this. I just didn't want to turn this into an academic presentation. The point is, we're starting to see that, not surprisingly, when you give someone a tool, the capabilities that tool can augment, also it can replace, and people don't use that capability as well. And if you don't use it, you often lose it. And we've seen this before, right? I don't know how many people on the call find that they're not as good at taking turn by turn directions while driving as they were 10, 15 years ago, but that's certainly true for me. Frankly, I'm not sure I was ever great at it, so the Google Maps was a savior for me. But we know that has eroded that faculty. Same thing with mental math. Again, you could argue how great people were at this in the 70s, but nobody even thinks to be good at it now. Same thing in the mid 90s. I probably knew a dozen phone numbers by heart. I only remember my family home from the 80s, and that's just because it's kind of embedded. So nobody really knows this. And these are just easy examples that I think people can just understand and walk away with. The broader point is AI is much more powerful than any of these technologies. And again, we're starting to see that it's having an impact. So why though? So, like I said, we mentioned some of these other technologies that have had this impact. Why is AI more? Why would we think AI is a bigger deal? Now, I kind of hinted at that it's a more general purpose technology than a Google map is or than a calculator. But what does that mean and why does that matter? So I'm going to walk through some reasons for this because they have an impact on your understanding of the problem, but also what you might choose to do with it later. So the first one is a big, big deal, and it's not just about learning. It's also about using AI. Just like the printed word, we default to trusting it. Its automation bias is actually a pretty well-studied thing. It didn't start with AI, it's just really bad with AI. And part of the problem is not only do we trust things that are printed, the things that we use to assume something is trustworthy are all true here, even if the underlying content is not. It's well formatted, it's grammatically correct, usually a plausible answer. All these are things that we look for trust, because in the rest of the world, outside of AI and outside of software, if something is well formatted, it's grammatically correct, and it looks like a good answer, it's probably because somebody spent real time on it and probably knew what they were doing. Real resources were spent to make the thing look good and look credible, which implies some amount of quality and certainly some amount of care. But because AI can spin that up in a minute or less, it doesn't imply that it's right. It just implies that it's really easy for AI to make it well formatted, grammatically correct, and a plausible answer. So, and the reality is, who has time to do everything? If I can offload some of my thinking, some of my mental work to AI, that's wonderful because I've got a whole list of other things to do. On the right here, I've got two screenshots of some of you may have even heard me talk about this, but this famous story where people had used ChatGPT for closing arguments and just for their work as a lawyer. You can't do that. And in one case, the person got a fine. Another one, I believe they were disbarred. So automation bias is a real thing. It's something to look out for. Obviously, it has an impact on learning, but again, it also has an impact on how people are going to operate with AI, or maybe we don't check things that we should check, a point that we will continue to make in other venues. So that's kind of one obvious one. Another one that's maybe a little less obvious for folks that don't spend their time thinking about learning, and a little bit of background, I'll say this again later, but my last startup, and I spent almost a decade looking at e-learning and how people learn and all that. So this happens to be an area of passion and interest for me. So anyway, the way you learn by doing is by doing the thing, right? And so if AI is taking some of the critical low-level work that builds intuition, well, are we missing something? So if I don't have, junior people going through specs to do submittal logs, are they losing something because they're not exposed to that work, to that constant kind of grinding work? Or running calculations. There's an old story about how investment bankers in their first 2 years would run a particular calculation called internal rate of return over and over and over again. So they built up an intuition for what a good deal is just by hearing it. Now I don't know how true that still is, but it gives you an idea. But similarly, having junior people draft agendas gives them an idea of what should be in a meeting, right? Or a summary, what should be important when you're kind of recounting something. So this work actually adds to the sum total of what you learn in the first couple of years, definitely out of school or out of, in your job. So, are we losing that? Well, the first answer is yes. And the second point is, was that always the best way to do that work? A point we're going to get to later. But nevertheless, it's a real thing right now. Another one that is very specific to AI is this idea of black box results. So, learning by reflection is actually more important than learning by doing. And what that means is after you've done the thing, you think back on it. You say, well, what just happened? Sometimes we do that consciously. Sometimes that's how our brains work. But the act of figuring things out means that you have to think about how they work. And if you're just getting an answer, you're not going to think about that. You don't have time for it. You're just going to take the answer, maybe, apply a sniff test and then move on. So a couple of things that come out of that. One of them is if you don't know what goes into something, you're not going to be as flexible a thinker and you're not going to be as creative. But the broader point here is reflection is actually a bigger part of learning than actually doing. Of course, there has to be some doing, but it doesn't mean very much if you haven't thought about it and really kind of onboarded the lessons from that. So that's a point we're going to get to in a little bit. So assuming that all that happens, what are the consequences? These are, again, kind of obvious that you wind up with a shallow expert pool. You don't have the same quality and breadth of thinking and of expertise. And that winds up meaning that when new things happen, people don't have quite the same repertoire. Obviously, when AI fails, if you have not been part of the process, you may not even catch that it failed. This is a little less true when you're asking it a simple question. But now imagine you've got an agent that's doing multi-step things, or you've gone and like I'm using deep research a lot, and it comes back with a pretty long report. Well, what if it made something up in the middle of that report? This all right now, these reports are for my own use and thinking and learning, so it's okay. But if I were to use that and in the middle of that there was some error that then compounded, we've got ourselves a problem. Obviously, regulatory and liability risks. At the end of the day, if we're offloading too much of this and we don't have any internal knowledge to figure it out, we've got ourselves a potential risk that someone will miss a thing or whatever the risk might be. And as I mentioned before, the act of learning prepares you for the act of being creative and innovative, right? It's the people that have been around a long time that often, contrary to belief, where we think that young people are more creative than older people, that has very much not been my experience. Actually, what winds up being true is that certainly from your 30s, you wind up having enough knowledge of a domain that you can be a lot more flexible of a thinker. And that comes back to this idea of experience and the things that you learn while you're doing the job. So the question is, okay, knowing that, is this are we done for? Is this, we should never adopt AI, or if we do, we're in trouble? Obviously, I don't think that's true, and today's discussion is partly to start with the problem and then begin discussing what we might be able to do about it. So I'm going to start with one kind of really high level view. And that is the very first thing to think about. Whether you want to make this into a formal effort or not is very much up to you. But mapping out and really thinking about what skills are needed. Now, construction is such an old industry that we take for granted very often what skills are needed because they've been that way. They've evolved slowly, thoughtfully, and certainly carefully over time. IBM is an extreme example of a general point. In 2016, I believe it was, they mapped their skills across the company. Now, they did this because they were an early AI, even though you wouldn't know it, they were an early AI adopter and provider. So they were trying to do things in the e-learning and some other things. This actually meant that when they said we're not going to hire, I believe it was admin and some certain sorts of engineers, because they really knew what skills those people needed. But the real value for what we're talking about here is if you think about the jobs that you have, you think about the skills required for each job, then you go and say, well, how do you really learn those skills? Do you really need to do the same thing over and over again to figure that out? By the way, don't spend a lot of time on the construction skills map. Again, I had OpenAI ChatGPT do that just to have some eye candy here. Um, but what this does, when you think deeply about what skills, what jobs, what functions your company needs, or your team needs, or you personally need, you can be thoughtful about replacing skill development. You can be thoughtful about saying, do I really need somebody to deeply know what happens in specs a lot? And do I need them to get that knowledge because they've looked at 10,000 pages or 20,000 pages, which is not unreasonable? Um, or is there a better way to do it? Is there a way to actually have them look at a few and then teach them general lessons in other ways? Most learning people will tell you that lots and lots of grunt work is highly overrated as a way to learn. It makes you feel as a manager like you're doing your job, but actually it's not the best way to learn, primarily because your brain shuts off and you just execute. You don't really think as much as people think we do. So that number of reps isn't necessarily the way to do it. In fact, again, evidence shows that it's actually one of the least effective ways to learn, and it has the unhappy side effect of making people really unsatisfied with their job. And in an industry that has a chronic skill shortage, that's a good thing to avoid. Do we need to do all that drafting, all the other things? And again, I obviously have an opinion. So let's kind of switch gears now that we've spent a second. I'm just going to make sure there's no. Now that we've spent a second thinking about what the problem is, what can we do about it? And is AI particularly good at that? Now, again, clearly I'm coming at this with a thesis. But let's start for a moment with probably the nerdiest slide that we're going to see today. And that is, how do you even learn? So there's three ideas. There's more than this in learning theory, but there's three that matter and that I want to talk about. One of them is this idea of cognitive load theory. Everybody's heard about working memory. If not, now you have. It turns out that working memory is it's basically that what you can hold in your memory to either repeat immediately or work with. There was a study a long time ago that said that most you can hold seven things in your memory. Now that's a little bit of a misdirect because you can chunk things together, so really you have more in your memory than seven. But the other thing is when you're in a busy job or you're doing things, seven's a lot. It's usually more like three or even two. So the point is thinking about how much work you're giving somebody and how you want them to learn is actually a little bit more complicated than just dump stuff on them and have them, do a lot. You have this opportunity to do what we call a scaffolded learning process. And we use that word to say we're supporting the learning process by saying, I'm asking someone to do just enough that they have a mental capacity to do the task, but then enough spare capacity to think and reflect. So if you think about your ability to really, operate beyond just getting things out the door when you're super busy, or another point here is emotional. If there's a lot of panic going on, nobody's thinking about learning, nobody's thinking about what's really going on. They're thinking about how do I make this problem go away and make everyone calm back down. So anxiety is not a wonderful backdrop for learning. Not that I'm telling you guys to avoid anxiety, it's just be aware that it's tougher to learn when everybody's putting pressure on each other. Which means that maybe you take times or you find moments that are less panicky or less anxiety inducing. Maybe it's at the end of the week, in the afternoon, whatever it is, to try to do some of this stuff that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So that's kind of one thing, is to just be aware of the fact that it's really hard to learn when you're so focused on getting the job done. So hopefully there's a little bit of spare capacity. You know that you're pushing someone to 90% or 85% of what they can do. So there's enough of their kind of mental capacity left to actually learn. The other one, which will surprise nobody in the trades for sure, is the idea of what's called situated learning. And this idea of situated is what it sounds like. You're in the situation. We learn best when we're doing the thing that's being discussed. Kind of obvious, right? If I tell you, make sure whenever you hammer nails down that you point it, I'm making this up, but you point it straight down and keep your thumbs out of the way. I'm kind of a dumb example of a broader point where if I'm telling you how to do something and then you get to walk over and go do the thing and then maybe watch somebody doing the thing, you're much more likely to learn it than if you're in a room watching slides or watching on a webinar, which obviously I have an opinion about. But situated learning is a big deal. It's hard to do in the past because most learning materials were printed or written or they were, on some video somewhere. But as we start to use AI tools in our day to day and we bring them with us, the tools themselves are powerful enough. Again, a point I'll expand on in a second, that you can start to introduce learning. Obviously, you want to be sensitive about safety and not distracting people when they're in a busy place, but you can start to think about a much more granular, much more situational presentation of learning, or maybe it's a little reminder, maybe it's a little question. I mean, there's ways to do this that a a mentor would do, right? Now, obviously, AI is not going to replace all of what a mentor can be, but some of what a mentor does is thoughtful questions in the middle of doing work that focus your mind and help you to actually take away some learning from your activity instead of just getting it done. The final one is pretty easy to understand also, and it's this idea of spaced repetition. It's a very well proven idea that cramming, everybody who's crammed for a test will agree that you can get some headway and you kind of don't have a choice, but way better to go and learn a thing, go away from it, come back. And there's actually a pattern of this where you want to be one day, a week, and a month. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's a good rule of thumb. So if you present an idea to somebody and then remember to send it to them again or expose them to it again in a week, then again in a month, and then maybe again in 2, 3 months, they're much more likely to actually learn the thing. Now, the problem is, how do you deliver that? Who's going to remember that? Here again is where the tools we're using open up new possibilities to really understand how learning works. Now, these three ideas together are not the most complicated thing in the world. You just don't hear them a lot. Just knowing that, make sure you don't give people too much at once, but not too little because then they get bored. Make sure that whatever you're doing is as situationally relevant as possible, and then try to repeat it over intervals that are more than an hour or two. See if you can do at least break it up by a day. Not very hard and pretty well validated across learning. And the point is, through the tools that we're starting to use more and more, whether it's Microsoft Teams, whether it's ChatGPT, or it's some specific tools from different companies, increasingly we have the opportunity to ask that this be part of what we do and give some thought to it. Maybe you make someone on the team responsible, just like somebody has been responsible for safety. I'm not suggesting you hire a learning officer, but maybe one of the PMs, maybe who knows. The point is, this isn't the hardest stuff to do. And actually, all it would really take is a couple of hours of thought and then maybe getting somebody to, make it work. So I'm going to take a quick breather there so you guys can kind of digest this idea that, well, number one, we have a problem. Number two, we're rapidly adopting tools that can help us to address that problem. Number three, we have some pretty good ideas about how to use those tools kind of at the higher level. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some things you might do to get ready for this or think about it. Look, this is not all happening tomorrow. So it's more like, can we make this into a once a quarter thing we look at, or once every half year, something we look at? So the first thing I would say is most knowledge is not necessarily prepared for learning, for delivery as a learning thing. So the first thing I would suggest people do is, and you don't need to spend any money on this. It just takes a little time and a little thought, is analyze the stuff you have and see how you might use that. The first thing is uploading, I say complex docs, but most companies have some how-tos. They have manuals, either they're getting them from an association or a union they're part of. A lot of people have generated their own internal SOPs. Sometimes that might include some of the how-to manuals for the software you use. All of that means you can upload this into Gemini or Claude or ChatGPT and start the process of saying, I want you to take this 100 pages or 200 pages, crunch it down into an outline for me. And then somebody looks at it. You don't want to just, kind of take it, but use that as the basis for experts, people that have been at it a long time, to go review and say, got it. I'm now going to kind of simplify this into an outline, simplify this into what I'm calling a knowledge base. And this is the basis that you guys can then use, because what we're finding and what we know is generative AI is really good at taking a document and doing interesting things with it. Yes, there's some testing involved, and yeah, you got to make sure that it's catching it and doing it the way you want. But the hardest part here is what that knowledge base is. And you've already done the hard part. But now it's okay, let's take all that stuff, put it into a format that isn't 1,000 pages, but actually is outlined the way we want. Again, company documents, some sample project documents, maybe some of the standards that are relevant to the work your team does. Certifications materials. I spent a lot of time at CSI, and I got to tell you, some of their manuals that are meant for certification are just absolutely gold mines of operating and process information. Do this, don't do that, stuff like that. So that's kind of step one. And you can get this done over a couple of steps. Maybe there's a team that deals with it, but it's not as hard as it might seem. And the AI is frankly doing a lot of the grunt work. You get to go and take the output of that grunt work, apply some judgment, maybe make some tweaks, and you've got something really meaningful. The next thing after that would be, all right, well, now that we've done the analysis, let's think about our job descriptions. Now, a couple of easy ways to do this. One of them is just an hour sitting there with a whiteboard or with a conversation and say, well, what are the jobs? Most companies in construction don't have an enormously complicated list of job descriptions. It's not like some larger company, like a big industrial company that's got divisions that do different things. So this should be a pretty doable thing. And then think about what the business needs. Again, doesn't need to be a deep discussion so much as, well, we know we've got, the next 2 years, we know we've got these projects that we're pursuing, we got these projects, or in the case of a trade, it might be where we know we get these sorts of things and we think we're going to have these sorts of problems. The point is, it doesn't have to be a deep, dark, multi-month process. It can just be a couple of meetings. And again, the content analysis is where the real grunt work is. But then you pop that into one of these chatbots. I would encourage you to use what they call canvas mode. It's easy to look up. Canvas mode means you can just iterate and collaborate as opposed to taking the output and then doing something else. The reason I say you want to iterate, so kind of play with it a little bit, maybe have it, try it again, is I find that the first couple times, I'm not blown away by the insight, but I am often impressed by some of the options. So it's not like there's some big insight driving all of it, but often if you say, give me 5 ideas, one of them will be like, wow, I didn't think of that, or wow, I like the way it described that, or the words it used, or whatever. So you're going to find quality, but it's uneven and it still very much needs an expert or certainly a manager who knows the business. But if you think about these steps, very doable, the kind of thing you could say over the next 2 months, we're going to meet 3 or 4 times max and get this done. And maybe we'll get some junior team to help us with some of the collection of documents and all that stuff. So if you start with getting your arms around what you would want to teach, then you say, great, how are we going to think about making sure this learning happens? The next part is, again, really interesting because content creation has just utterly changed in the last couple of months. I don't know how many of you have played around with ChatGPT's image generation, but it's wildly good. This looks like a stock image, and it took me a minute to do. One prompt, and up it came. So, and it's a little stupid. I had to play around with it. If I really cared, I mean, if it was really, it's not that I don't care. If it was really important that this be perfect, you can iterate. You can continue to iterate until it gets exactly what you want, right? I'm not sure having a big microphone in the middle mattered. I just wanted it to be about voice. But similarly, so images are actually really easy. And what I didn't do, and you can do, is take your images and have them be the basis of what ChatGPT does. Really encourage everybody to try that if you have not done it yet. The other thing you might do, just as a quick aside, put temporary chat on if you're going to use project documents for now, anyway. Um, the text is, I mean, we just talked about how to do that, but you can create scripts, you can create, outlines, you can create, various other things. Once again, I would use Canvas mode because it allows you to go in line by line and ask the AI to augment something. You can write it in yourself. It's just a way more powerful collaborative mode. I think we're going to be using things like Canvas a lot more over the coming year or so because it's such a powerful way to work with AI and not just take what the output is, but do something useful with it. Voice, this is something that is way easier to do now than it was even 2 or 3 months ago. I use a product called Descript. Notebook LM does some interesting stuff. 11 Labs I found really expensive. Quite frankly, they're good to be part of a workflow, but not good on their own, I found. The other one that's wild is video. So I know Sora because I spent so much time in the ChatGPT interface, but there's a number of really, really good video creation platforms. Typically, what winds up happening is really interesting that they'll only let you do some number of seconds, but then you can take an older one, take a screenshot, and then make that the beginning of the next one. So making a 1 minute video that's really, really good and exactly like you want, it takes some work, but it's a lot easier than having real video. It's certainly a lot cheaper than paying someone to do it for you. So as you think about video, just know that already in the end of April 2024, 2025, you already have amazing tools, and you absolutely can expect that over the coming year, it's just going to get better and better. Where maybe you take an old video and have it do things for you. In fact, you can kind of do that now. Just the ability to tell it what you want and then tell it how to tweak what it gave you is becoming so much better that people that don't know how to do this stuff in terms of video, in terms of image, all that stuff, it's really removing the need for that type of skill. So Danny asked a great question about transcribing existing videos. Go to Descript first. Yeah, there's a bunch of them, but I like Descript, so it's I think at descript.com. There's a few things I like about them. One of them is they give you the transcription, then you can go into the English, like the text, and pull a word out, and it'll make an edit for you. So, if anybody's, again, back to this idea of not needing the skills that you used to need. I'm never going to learn nonlinear real editing where you can move things around and do all that fancy stuff. I have no interest in that. You can just go in Descript. You can just grab the content in English, like the text, pull it out, move it around. It just gives you really easy tools to use. So yeah, I'd go there first. The reality is there's a lot of tools out there. I just find Descript is kind of made for that. It's actually a podcasting platform, among other things. So it's made for that kind of limited skill editor, limited skill transcription. So, good stuff. The other thing, by the way, that I like about it, depending on what you're trying to do, is because it's made for real language content, it'll automatically pull out ums and ahs and all the other things that we just, we naturally do, and actually other humans don't even hear until you're listening to yourself in a recording and are horrified what a bumbler you sound like. So yeah, Descript would be the one I'd go for. Thank you for that question. So the next one is a little harder and a little bit more forward-looking. And this is this idea of lesson relevance. So we know that people are increasingly using various types of AI, in their work, like during the work. So it's going to know one way or the other what you're doing. Maybe not always, but there will be moments where it will have the ability to know that I'm working on this, or that because I've asked it a question or I prompt it. Maybe it's integrated with a schedule or you're asking it things that are schedule related. It may already know what workflow it's part of because that's the kind of product you're using. The final one is agents. Like as agents become more prevalent, and I think it's going to take a little longer than people think, but you're certainly seeing it this year. Agents are going to be given goals. So again, they're going to know what they're being used for. So these are some of the ways that AI will reasonably know what it's being used for, and thus what's likely to be a relevant lesson. So for the first time, there's software that is going to be smart enough and it's going to be present that can say, this looks like a good time to send, Hugh a question or a reminder, or did you notice? Like there's a bunch of ways that you might consider doing this and thinking about naturally delivering this content. Before would be great if possible, and often isn't possible. Immediately after, or maybe even sometimes during. But the point is, the problem is fresh in someone's mind. Now, here's a really counterintuitive point. It is way better to ask someone a question about something before they learn it than it is to do it after. You still want to do it afterwards. But asking a question beforehand has been proven to be a really powerful way to learn something, because then you're paying attention to what that question was about as you do whatever it is you do. Frankly, questions that people haven't been prepped for also will annoy them. So just be aware of the fact that not everything is there are two sides to every coin. But and again, as you'll see at the end, I'm happy to talk to anyone. This is a really important thing, and anyone that wants to kind of dig into this, grab me later, and I'm happy to talk about it. This idea of workflow integration, so multimodal AI. The other thing is AI, as I just showed you, really good at images, really good at video, going to be in the tools you're using. And whether somebody meant to build it in there or not, it's usually part of the LLM that their product is based on. So this idea of inline learning is much more possible than it would have been before. And then thinking about an inconvenient, interruption. Some of you may remember Clippy from way back in the 90s, which, is like famously the most annoying helper ever. Microsoft would put this thing in that was a paperclip, and it would pop up when you didn't, all the time, to show you about all the wonderful new tools that they'd created in their Microsoft Office. And everybody went nuts, and I think it took them like 2 years to get rid of it. So we obviously don't want that. But that's just user experience. That's software teams have been worrying about this exact problem forever. So it shouldn't be something you can't handle or you can't get good advice on, or certainly you can test it. And if people get annoyed, you do it differently. The point is, we have possibilities we didn't before. And really, today's discussion is making you aware of a problem, some possible solutions, and maybe some things that you might do or at least consider doing over the coming months. Because this is happening, and it's happening pretty quickly, especially for younger folks. And ultimately, the other thing I didn't put in the deck here, the people we are most worried about are the ones most likely to be using AI, right? I'm not worried about a 45-year-old forgetting how to do things or never learning, or gaining intuition. I'm worried about someone in their 20s who's new and is probably a heavy user of ChatGPT anyway, or one of the AI tools. So that makes it doubly relevant. So, as I've kind of hinted at here, it lowers friction to create and personalize. Personalization we haven't talked about too much, but certainly you can make it relevant to you, the project and the work being done. This idea of just-in-time microlearning. So microlearning is actually a pretty well-established idea. Instead of giving somebody an hour's worth of, video or whatever, we're going to have them get little snippets here and there. Maybe it's 5 minutes, maybe it's, some text. But also this idea of democratizing mentorship, excuse me, making it a little easier to have someone act as a mentor, either through the AI. So the AI, kind of empowers them and gives them more ability to reach people, or just delegating it to the AI, depending on what we're talking about. So this is sort of back to the theory a little bit, but this idea of you learn, you do, and then you think about it, is really, really powerful, and AI can help at each one of those phases. Interestingly, way back, I actually created a product that used AI to do daily reports. This is in 2018. And the original reason we built that is we had created a tool that would call you based on your, like literally call your phone based on what was in your calendar. And if it saw a meeting with whatever you told it to look for, it would call and say, how did that meeting go? So it was actually a post-meeting journaling tool that would transcribe what you did, and then you could do analysis on it. And the value there is very often learning is about coaching. It's about working on one thing like, oh my gosh, I got to do better at closing, or I got to do better at opening, or whatever it might be. This is a nice way to reflect after the fact on a meeting and use that to learn. Point being is that the reflection side of it has been around for a long time, and it's way easier to do now than it was in 2018. So you think about, the LLM, then you create some prompt libraries. Again, easier to do than it sounds like. Possibly creating a knowledge graph. Let's park that idea, but definitely now you've heard the term knowledge graph. It's a nice one to know. And then, you may or may not use a learning management system. If your company's using one already, it can be a good way to keep track of what you're doing. They're catching up, and of course, they have every interest in being part of this. In fact, they may help with some of what I'm talking about. But then, this is where the experts come in: content validation, bias, and make sure that the IP you're using, and then figuring out, how are we measuring? The delivery of this can often have some measurement in it, and you can often link, okay, well, it sounds like Hugh's getting better at doing submittal logs, let's call it, because he's been learning about it, and I've found that they're better. That's really up to you guys. Just know that it's really made it easier to do than it was. So kind of summarizing what I was saying before, creating a knowledge base is a good idea for a couple of reasons. One of them is this learning thing. The other one, though, is it crystallizes why your company is better than the competition. So it might wind up being useful for pursuit anyway. But chatbots, agents, other tools are all going to be able to access this. There's a product out there, or a standard out there called Model Context Protocol that's going to make stuff like this even easier. We're going to talk about that in, I think, the next meeting. But the point is, it's just the infrastructure is there to make this knowledge base a lot more accessible than it would have been in earlier eras. Again, they can create, organize, and index your content, helping you keep track. I find one of the problems with chatbots, ironically, is they can create content so easily you wind up with too much of it. So having them help you to organize and then index it so you can find it later is really useful. So look, I obviously feel strongly about this. This idea of de-skilling freaks me out a little bit. I think it's a problem across industries, and I think it's a real problem in construction. So would love people to just keep that in your mind as things progress. I think that not creating the knowledge base itself just makes a lot of sense, and would be smart to be a priority. Obviously, you make your own choices. Um, here's this is me speaking as a software guy, but I think that a growing requirement and a consideration is that for any to expect that there will be there are construction e-learning companies, but it's really hard for them to make money. And again, I know because I had an e-learning startup in 2016 to 2019 time period. It's really hard to make money, and most companies don't pay for it. Construction is definitely on the low end of paying for learning management systems and so on. So all of this stuff is probably not going to be a standalone product. The exception, of course, is always safety, but generally speaking, now that this capability is so general, I think it makes sense to say, thank you for bringing me this AI product. Are you able to incorporate learning? Are you able to have things and help me to think about how you can do that? Explain to me how you can use your tool to encourage learning. We do that with my company, The Link, whether it's an AI part of the product or a not AI product part of the product, because it comes up so much. Specs are one of those things where everybody thinks you need to read 20,000 pages of it to know what you're doing, and I obviously differ. So I think, the idea that you're supplying the content back to that learning, that knowledge base, but you're asking them to say, how are you going to use your tool to deliver some of this? I don't think it's a heavy lift. Some people will say, I'm sorry, we just can't do that. And okay, fair enough. You make up your own mind. But enough of them have the native ability to do this that I think it's a smart thing to ask for. And I don't think it should change any terms in terms of price or any of that. Obviously, I have an opinion, and not everyone will share that opinion. But the point is, we now have with AI these pretty general purpose tools that can be used for this, as well as the main reason you're doing business with them. So, some tactical thoughts on this. So you can treat AI as a co-pilot, not autopilot. This is going to be a big deal and something that I feel like should be a bumper sticker at this point. Think about critical thinking checkpoints in workflows. I'll tell you, there's a really interesting tool out there that can help you to check whether the AI is catching everything, where they'll hide interesting content in the middle of a document, like random content, like all sparrows are red or whatever, or blue, I guess it would be. And it has nothing to do. And when then they ask the AI what color are sparrows, it'll show that it was able to catch everything. The same thing you can do for humans, which is to say, or for your workforce, is along the way ask questions or make sure they caught something. You kind of do this anyway, but just think about it. Rotating manual practice to preserve baseline competence. So maybe one spec division out of an entire project. The other thing here is explainable AI tools. Our friends at Anthropic are really lowering the bar here, or lowering the barrier, I guess, to explain what's going on. But the point is, wherever possible, make sure that the answers have a little explanation so you know what's going on. And then this idea of teaching people how to think, like that should be part of mentorship anyway. But how are you framing problems? What are some ways to verify things? What are some rules of thumb and heuristics that work for you? So here's some ideas that you can take or leave, but I think they're going to become part of managing a team to a degree that maybe was less true when AI wasn't augmenting and being such a useful part of the workflow. So, kind of recapping a lot of that is, the over reliance on AI is going to risk de-skilling. We got to pay attention to this. AI can really accelerate learning when you're applying learning theory and actually really thinking about how learning happens. You don't need to be a chief learning officer. This is some pretty straightforward stuff. Again, be relevant. Don't give them too much at once, and repeat it over time as opposed to all at once. So I think there's a real opportunity here. I'm gonna move a little bit quickly. I'm gonna skip that one and just keep going. So the final thing that I'll point out is AI itself is a learning requirement. So it's fundamentally new, right? So I think it's similar to the introduction of computers to work in the 80s. Most people don't remember that, but this was a huge point of stress for a lot of people that weren't at sort of the cutting edge. Like, I looked at my mother and my father. My father was where I clearly get the nerd from. He went nuts on this sort of stuff. He learned how to write DOS, all that, and he was a banker. It's not like he was a technology guy. In contrast, my mother never got into it, and it was a huge point of stress that she didn't really know how to use computers until like 15 years later. And it shouldn't have been, and there just weren't a lot of opportunities to learn. I think AI is similar to that, and some people are digging in. If you're on this call, on this webinar, you're probably one of the people digging in. But there's going to be people who need a little bit of help. And the point here is this isn't the same as Excel versus SAS, which itself has been a long process. SAS didn't really introduce new risks. Not, I mean, some, but not really. And it really didn't change workflows. It made them better. It made them tighter. It maybe made them more integrated. But you were doing a lot of the same things in SAS that you were doing in Excel, whereas in AI, you're really doing different things. You're asking it questions, you're asking it to solve things, so on and so forth. Because it's new, there's more value in learning. Are you doing prompting clinics? Maybe you're teaching people, having them come to some of the best free webinars on the web. I don't know who that would be, but I've got some thoughts. But the point is, there's value in spending time to make sure people learn this so they don't get left behind and don't feel left behind. What makes that even more complicated is, unlike other software, we're really building the plane as we fly it, and the plane is flying faster than anything else. So, earlier tech changed so slowly that the difference between Windows 93 or 95, I guess it was, my gosh, in Windows 2000, it was more buttons, but it was basically the same thing. That's not true with AI. Like, fundamental things are still changing. So, like, how you prompt has gotten a lot, has changed. How much you can trust them has changed, in that you can trust them more, but you still have to be vigilant. What they can do expands almost monthly. So you can think about three levels of these tools. You got chatbots, which, basically you're interfacing directly with the model. Point solutions, which are like, brands that you're hearing about, whether it's my company, The Link, or Trunk Tools, or so on. The big one everybody's going to use the most is in-platform solutions, right? And actually, I think this is way better than using ChatGPT if you're working for a company. But Copilot's a big one. So it's really important to remember that people need to learn how to use this, and it's more than just a half an hour how-to. It should be an ongoing series of opportunities. Um, so kind of coming in for a landing here, so to speak, I mean, with these plain metaphors. When you think about it, learning strategy for fast-moving tech, try to separate the general from the specific. What are general points about what AI is? How does it even work? Starting to build an intuition and giving people the opportunity to kind of themselves build an intuition and play with it. Then you're going to think the specifics. You just still need to learn how to use a tool, but that often is going to be much more quick little how-tos. Maybe it's little videos. Maybe you're just telling the AI how to teach, how to use itself. Um, like how to use Copilot or what's ChatGPT good at, and so on. These things are going to change, and they're changing again really quick. But giving people a comfort level and a healthy suspicion of I think is a general point that is going to last. It's not something that's going to run out of relevance. So kind of bringing it all together, some key takeaways here is I think you should encourage experimentation, have people play around with this stuff, even if it's for planning a birthday or whatever it might be. You just begin to get more comfortable with it, but also get a real sense of its limits. One of the problems I think right now is if you're listening to the wrong things, it sounds like the robots are going to take over in 2 years. We're all going to be screwed, and that's the end of humanity. Or the lighter version of that is someone's going to fire me in the next 3 years because AI is going to take my job. I'll tell you what, nothing reassures somebody about the security of their job more than trying to do an even mildly complicated thing with AI and realize it runs out of gas pretty quickly in terms of its capability and its complexity. So I think experimentation, learning is one huge reason to do it, but another good one is to give people a little reassurance that these things are still really useful, but really limited. It's like saying that an intern is going to take over your job in a year. Very much not true. So again, I also think that spending time on privacy and IP policies is worth it, and not a lot of time, but just think about things like where does project data get used? How do you what, how do you have a policy about the last person to see something can't be an AI, it has to go through a human, so on and so forth. This is where lunch and learns make a lot of sense. There's plenty of people that'll do this. Vendors will do this. I do this stuff all the time. It often, the other one I've found really powerful when you hear about people doing interesting stuff, people that are in the work, people that are in the field, that are operating in the business, they figure something new out. Celebrate that because it gives people ideas about how they might make their own work easier. A really cool example happened recently where I'd been doing some work with SmackNow, and one of the guys that had paid attention to the webinars I do with them learned a little bit, felt comfortable, used ChatGPT to figure out how to make their timesheets. This is a subcontractor, make their timesheets more reactive, and like it highlights rows and so on, so you don't get lost because they're really, really big spreadsheets. Look, that's a really small thing, it sounds like, but it's a big deal because now all the people using that timesheet, their life is just a little bit easier. And look, he didn't pay anyone to do it. He spent probably an hour, maybe two, playing around, figuring it out, made it work. And now the next time he does it, he's more comfortable and it's going to be, that's not going to take 2 hours. He knows how to do that sort of thing. And literally, it wrote code for him, told him where to put it, told him how to save it as a template. And now he's got something really interesting done. Well, we told that to other people, and it just opens up the idea that you don't need to be an IT consultant to do interesting, useful things. And I don't need to pay $5,000 to some external consultant to do something. I can do it myself. One of the points we often bring up is construction is loaded with problem solvers that are good at using tools. That's what we're talking about with AI. So to the degree you can teach people how to use it, make them feel comfortable, their natural creativity and understanding of the workflow is going to mean that opportunities to make the work better are going to come up in ways that you can't anticipate, because that's exactly what problem solvers do. So, folks, that's it. That's my kind of presentation for today. Reach out. This is an area, as I mentioned, I'm super passionate about. So I think there's a lot to be done here. So happy to help people along the way. So again, feel free. Yeah, yeah. Somebody pointed out nothing wrong with paying an external consultant 500 pounds in this case. That's right. I think that, pick your battles would be my point, Nabil. Thank you for that. So thank you all. I'm going to hang around for another 5, 10 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or if anybody's got things they'd like to discuss. Here we are.